The metal around me was still hissing when I opened my eyes. Smoke filled the broken hull of my scout ship, and my ears rang with a sound that would not stop. I tried to move my legs, but pain shot through my side, and I understood, in that first breath, that my ship was gone, and my squad was gone with it. My name is Vesa Thal, and I am a scout of the Corin fleet. We were sent to observe a human outpost on the edge of a system called Varan 6, nothing more than a quiet watch mission, a simple task before the real invasion began. We were told humans were savage, that they killed without asking questions, that they had wiped out 3 other species who dared to stand in their path. We were told to avoid contact at all costs. My captain broke that order when curiosity got the better of him, and now he was dead, and so was everyone else who had trusted him. I pulled myself across the twisted floor of the cockpit, past the still bodies of my crewmates, and I did not let myself look at their faces for too long. There was no time for grief. There was only the need to survive, though some small voice inside me wondered if survival even mattered anymore. My scanner flickered weakly on my wrist, showing me that the human base was close, far too close for comfort. If they had found our wreckage, they would already be coming. I dragged myself out through a broken seam in the hull and into open air that smelled of burning metal and wet earth. The forest around the crash site was thick and unfamiliar, full of tall trees with silver bark that I had never seen before. My breathing came out ragged, and every step sent fire through my ribs. I did not know if my wounds were fatal, only that they hurt more than anything I had felt before. I found a hollow beneath a fallen tree and pressed myself into it, trying to make myself small, trying to disappear. My hands shook as I checked my sidearm, the only weapon I had left, and found it half destroyed from the crash. Even if I wanted to fight, I had almost nothing to fight with. All I had was the training drilled into me since I was young. If a human finds you, do not surrender, because humans do not take prisoners, they only take lives. I heard footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate, crunching over fallen branches. My chest tightened, and I pressed my back harder against the tree, trying to control my breathing so it would not give me away. The footsteps grew closer, and closer still, until I could hear the soft sound of boots, stopping just a few lengths from where I hid. A voice called out, calm and steady, speaking words I did not understand at first, though the tone was not what I expected. It did not sound angry. It did not sound like a hunter closing in on prey. It sounded almost gentle, the way one might speak to a frightened animal caught in a trap. I stayed silent, my hand tightening around my broken weapon, though I knew it would do little good. The footsteps came closer again, and then a shadow fell across the opening of my hiding place. I looked up, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a human. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back from her face, and she wore a uniform marked with symbols I did not recognize. She held no weapon raised toward me, though I could see one resting at her hip. Her eyes found mine, and for a long moment neither of us moved. I braced myself, certain this was the end, certain that whatever mercy I imagined in her voice a moment ago was only a trick before the final blow. She did not draw her weapon. Instead, she raised both her hands slowly, palms open, and took a single step back. She said something again, softer this time, and though I still could not understand her words, something in the gesture made my racing heart slow, just slightly. I did not trust it. I could not trust it. Everything I had ever learned told me this was a trap, a cruel game, before the true violence began. My people had stories of humans who smiled at their prisoners before doing terrible things, stories meant to warn us, to keep us far away from their kind. I searched her face for the cruelty I had been told to expect, but I found only steady patience, and something that looked almost like concern. My vision began to blur at the edges, my wounds finally demanding more than I had left to give. I tried to push myself up, tried to put distance between us, but my legs would not obey me anymore. I felt myself sliding down against the tree, my strength draining away like water through open fingers. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the human woman moving forward, not with a weapon, but with her hands still open, still empty, kneeling down beside me as if I were something worth saving rather than something worth destroying. I did not understand it. I did not want to understand it. All I could think, in that final moment of consciousness, was that I had crashed among monsters, and yet the monster kneeling beside me looked nothing like the stories I had been told. Everything after that was silence, and I did not know if I would ever open my eyes again. When I woke again, the pain in my side had dulled into a steady ache instead of a burning fire, and the air around me smelled of clean metal instead of smoke. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure if I was still alive or if this was some strange place between life and death. Above me was a curved ceiling lined with soft lights, and beneath me was a bed far softer than anything I had known aboard my own ship. I tried to sit up, and pain reminded me quickly that my body was still healing. A bandage wrapped tightly around my ribs, and when I looked down at my arms, I saw careful stitching along a wound I did not remember receiving. Someone had treated me. Someone had kept me alive. My mind raced through every terrible possibility. Perhaps they were keeping me alive only to study me, the way one might keep an insect alive long enough to examine how it dies. Perhaps this comfort was simply the beginning of something crueler, a slow unraveling designed to break my spirit before they broke my body. I had heard enough warnings about human cruelty to expect anything, and I braced myself for pain that never seemed to come. The door to the room slid open, and the same woman from the forest stepped inside, carrying a tray with something warm on it. She paused when she saw I was awake, and her face shifted into an expression I did not immediately recognize. It took me a moment to understand that she was smiling, and that the smile seemed genuine, not the mocking kind I had been taught to expect from her kind. She spoke again, slower this time, pointing to herself. "Ellen." She repeated the sound twice, and I understood she was giving me her name. I did not offer mine in return, not yet, not until I understood what kind of trap I had fallen into. She set the tray down beside me, and the smell of warm food reached me before I even looked at it. My stomach twisted painfully, hunger overtaking suspicion for just a moment before I forced myself to sit still. Ellen did not force me to eat. She simply placed the tray within reach and stepped back, giving me space, watching me with patient eyes rather than demanding eyes. I stared at the food for a long time, certain it might be poisoned, certain this small kindness was only the opening move in a longer game. Yet as the minutes passed and nothing happened, as she simply waited without pressing me, doubt began to creep into my certainty. I ate slowly, watching her the entire time, waiting for her expression to change into something darker. It never did. When I finished, she took the tray away without a word, only offering a small nod before leaving the room again. I lay back against the bed, more confused than I had been since waking, unable to make sense of what I had just experienced. Over the following days, a pattern began to form. Ellen would visit in the mornings, checking my wounds with careful hands, never rough, never impatient even when my body flinched away from her touch out of old habit. She brought food twice each day, and sometimes she brought small items too, things I did not recognize at first, until I understood they were meant to help pass the long hours of my recovery. A soft cloth toy, shaped like some kind of small animal. A device that played gentle sounds meant to help with sleep. Things that made no sense for a captor to offer a prisoner. I remained wary through it all. I searched every visit for the moment the cruelty would begin, watching for signs of the interrogation I was certain would come, the questions asked with threats behind them, the pain used to pry secrets from my mind. Instead, there were only quiet conversations I could not fully understand, delivered in a calm voice that never rose in anger, even when I refused to respond. One evening, a different human entered the room, a man with short hair and tired eyes, wearing the same uniform as Ellen. He introduced himself as Daniel, and unlike Ellen's gentle patience, there was a weariness about him that made me tense immediately. I assumed this was where the true nature of my captivity would finally reveal itself. Daniel sat down in a chair near my bed, not too close, and studied me for a long moment before speaking. He spoke slowly, using simple words, gesturing sometimes to help me understand. He was trying to teach me, I realized. He wanted me to learn enough of their language to communicate, to explain who I was and why I had been near their base. I answered his questions carefully at first, giving only the smallest pieces of information, still certain that whatever I said would eventually be used against me. Yet as the days passed into weeks, no punishment came. No threats followed my hesitant answers. When I refused to explain certain things about my fleet's movements, Daniel simply nodded and moved on to other questions, never pressing harder, never raising his voice. It confused me more than any cruelty could have. I had prepared myself for pain, and instead I received patience, and I did not know what to do with patience. There was a night when the pain in my side flared badly, deep beneath the healing skin, and I could not keep myself from making a sound of distress. I expected no one to come, certain that whatever comfort I had received so far was reserved for daylight hours, for moments when it served some purpose I could not yet see. But the door slid open within minutes, and Ellen rushed in, her hair loose from sleep, concern written plainly across her face. She checked my wounds quickly, her hands steady despite the late hour, and when she found nothing seriously wrong, only a natural ache from healing tissue, she did not leave immediately. She sat beside my bed instead, speaking softly, her voice carrying a rhythm that felt almost like the way a parent might soothe a frightened child. I did not understand her words, but I understood the intention behind them, and slowly my racing heart began to calm. I studied her face in the dim light of the room, searching once again for any trace of the deception I still expected to find. All I saw was tiredness and genuine worry, and something that looked uncomfortably close to care. It unsettled me more than any threat could have. My entire life, I had been taught that humans were incapable of such gentleness, that their reputation for mercilessness was earned through countless acts of cruelty against those who trusted them. Yet here, in the quiet hours of the night, I found only kindness offered freely, without any demand for something in return. I began to test the boundaries of my captivity in small ways, expecting resistance at every turn. I asked, through broken words and gestures, if I could see outside the room. I expected refusal, expected to be reminded of my place as a prisoner. Instead, within a few days, Daniel arranged for me to be moved to a small courtyard within the base, still watched, still guarded, but allowed to feel open air and sunlight against my skin for the first time since the crash. The other humans I encountered during these outings regarded me with curiosity rather than hatred. Some kept their distance, clearly uncertain about my presence, but none showed the violent hostility I had braced myself for. A few even offered small nods of acknowledgement as they passed, the kind of gesture one might give to any stranger sharing the same space, not the kind reserved for a captured enemy. I found myself growing suspicious of my own suspicion. Surely this could not be simple kindness. Surely there was some deeper purpose behind it, some strategy I had not yet uncovered. I turned the question over endlessly in my mind during the long hours alone in my room, unable to reconcile what I was experiencing with everything my people had taught me about the creatures who called themselves human. One afternoon, Ellen brought a small device into my room, one that projected images into the air above it. She showed me pictures of her family, gesturing at each one with warmth in her voice, explaining who they were, in words I was beginning to understand more each day. A mother with silver hair, a younger sibling with a wide, easy smile, a small animal she called a dog, curled up on a porch somewhere far from this base. It was such an ordinary thing to share, and yet it struck me deeply, because monsters in the stories I had been raised on did not have mothers, or siblings, or animals they loved enough to keep their pictures close. I did not know what to make of any of it. Every day brought new evidence that contradicted everything I thought I understood about humanity, and every night I lay awake trying to decide if I was simply being deceived very slowly, or if perhaps, impossibly, the stories I had been told my entire life were built on something far less than the whole truth. I still did not trust them completely. Trust felt like a dangerous thing to offer so quickly, especially after a lifetime of warnings. But for the first time since the crash, I found myself wondering less about when the cruelty would begin, and more about what kind of creatures these humans truly were, beneath the reputation that had followed them across the stars. The weeks that followed changed something inside me that I did not fully understand until much later. My wounds healed fully, the stitches removed, the ache in my ribs fading into nothing more than a faint memory. With my body strong again, I expected the kindness to end, expected the true purpose of my captivity to finally reveal itself now that I was no longer fragile and helpless. Instead, the humans simply continued as they had before, treating me with the same steady patience, only now allowing me more freedom to move through parts of the base. I began to learn their language more quickly once my strength returned, spending hours each day with Daniel, who seemed to take genuine satisfaction in watching my understanding grow. He was not what I expected from a soldier of a species known for its ferocity. He laughed often, especially at his own mistakes when trying to pronounce words from my own language in return. He asked me about my home, about the Koran, with real curiosity rather than the calculated interest of an interrogator searching for weaknesses to exploit. Ellen remained close throughout this time as well, though her visits shifted from medical checks to something closer to friendship, if such a word could even apply between a human and one of the Koran. She began teaching me small things beyond language, showing me how humans marked the passing of time with celebrations, how they gathered together to share meals not out of necessity, but out of enjoyment. I found myself looking forward to these moments, though I still felt a flicker of guilt each time I did, as if enjoying anything within this place was a betrayal of everything I once believed. It was during this time that I first met Colonel Voss, the officer who commanded the base. Where Ellen and Daniel had shown me patience, Voss regarded me the way I had originally expected all humans to regard me, with cold suspicion and barely hidden hostility. He believed I was a threat that should be handled with far greater caution, perhaps even eliminated, rather than allowed to move freely among his people. I overheard him arguing with Daniel one evening, his voice sharp with frustration, insisting that keeping me alive and unrestrained was a risk the entire base could not afford. I remember standing frozen outside the door of that meeting room, listening to Voss list every reason why I should not be trusted, why my presence endangered everyone around me. Old fear returned in that moment, sharper than before, because here at last was the cruelty I had been waiting for, wearing a human face just as my people had warned. Yet what surprised me most was not Voss's hostility, which felt familiar and expected, but Daniel's firm refusal to bend to it. Daniel argued that I had done nothing to harm anyone since my arrival, that I had cooperated fully, that punishing kindness with sudden cruelty would prove nothing except that Voss's fears were baseless to begin with. Ellen joined the argument as well, her voice steady despite clearly speaking against someone who outranked her. She said something I would not fully understand until later, when my grasp of their language had grown stronger, about how the measure of their humanity was not found in how they treated their allies, but in how they treated someone who had once been considered an enemy. Voss was not convinced easily. Over the following days, he pushed for stricter measures, insisting on additional guards whenever I moved through the base, requesting that my movements be monitored more closely than before. I felt the tension of it settle over the base like a heavy fog, and I began to wonder if my small taste of freedom was about to be taken away entirely. One evening, Voss came to my room directly, without Daniel or Ellen present, to soften his approach. He studied me with narrowed eyes, speaking slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether I would flinch beneath his scrutiny. He asked me questions about my fleet, about numbers and positions I still refused to share, and when I remained silent, his frustration grew visible on his face. For a moment, I truly believed the calm I had experienced these past weeks was about to shatter completely. It was Ellen who arrived before things escalated further, stepping into the room with a firmness I had not seen from her before. She spoke to Voss directly, her tone respectful but unyielding, reminding him of something about their laws, their codes of conduct regarding prisoners who posed no immediate danger. Voss left the room without another word, though the look he gave me on his way out told me clearly that his suspicion of me had not faded, only been delayed. After he left, Ellen sat beside me, and I saw genuine exhaustion in her expression, the kind that comes from constantly defending something you believe in against those who refuse to see it the same way. I asked her, in my still imperfect grasp of her language, why she continued to protect me when doing so clearly cost her something within her own community. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. She told me that where she came from, strength was not measured only by what a person could destroy, but by what they chose to protect, even when protecting it was difficult. She said that anyone could be kind to those who agreed with them, but true character showed itself in how someone treated those who had once stood against them. I did not fully understand every word, but I understood the meaning beneath them, and it settled into me like something I would carry for the rest of my life. In the days that followed, I began to spend time with others on the base beyond Ellen and Daniel. A young engineer named Owen showed me the workings of their machinery, delighted by my curiosity about their technology, comparing notes eagerly about how differently our two peoples had solved similar problems. A woman named Grace, who worked in their communications department, taught me songs from her childhood, laughing warmly whenever I mispronounced the words in my attempts to sing along. None of them treated me as an enemy to be feared, nor as a prize to be paraded before others. They treated me, more than anything else, as simply another person who happened to come from somewhere very far away. It was such a small thing, and yet it undid years of fear, built carefully within me by every story I had ever been told about humanity. I began to notice, too, how the humans treated each other, not just how they treated me. I watched them argue and disagree, sometimes fiercely, yet always finding their way back to cooperation afterward. I watched them support each other through difficult moments, checking on one another with the same careful attention Ellen had once given my wounds. There was a warmth running through this community that I had never expected to find among a species defined, in my mind, only by their capacity for violence. Yet I also began to understand, slowly, that the fierceness my people feared was not entirely a lie either. I overheard stories from soldiers who had fought in difficult campaigns, tales of battles fought with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. I began to realize that humans were not simply gentle creatures hiding behind a false reputation, nor were they simply monsters hiding behind false kindness. They were something far more complicated than either extreme, capable of tremendous ferocity when threatened, and equally capable of tremendous gentleness when given the chance to extend it. This realization unsettled me at first, because it meant the world was far less simple than I had been taught to believe. It would have been easier, in some ways, to continue believing humans were simply monsters, or to decide they were simply misunderstood. Instead, I had to accept a harder truth, one that demanded I think for myself rather than relying on the stories handed down to me since childhood. One night, sitting with Ellen and Daniel beneath the open sky outside the base, watching strange constellations I did not recognize, I finally found the courage to ask the question that had been building inside me for weeks. I asked them directly why they had chosen mercy that day in the forest, when every reason available to them would have justified simply ending my life instead. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that killing me would have been easy, and perhaps expected, but that easy choices were rarely the ones worth making. He said that the moment they found me wounded and afraid, I had stopped being an enemy soldier and become simply another living being in need of help, and that turning away from someone in that state was not a kind of strength his people wished to embody. Ellen added something that stayed with me long afterward. She said that if humanity only extended kindness to those who had never opposed them, that kindness would mean very little. It was easy to be gentle with friends. It meant something far greater to be gentle with someone who had every reason to expect otherwise. I sat beneath that unfamiliar sky, surrounded by people I had once believed capable only of cruelty, and I felt something shift permanently within me. The fear I had carried since the crash had not disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something new, something I did not yet have the words to fully describe. Perhaps it was gratitude, perhaps it was the beginning of trust. Whatever it was, I knew in that moment that I would never see my own people's stories about humanity the same way again. It was Daniel who finally told me the fuller story of his people, one evening when the base had grown quiet and most of the others had already gone to rest. I had asked him, perhaps too directly, why a species capable of such warmth carried a reputation across the stars that spoke only of destruction. He looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding how much of the truth I was ready to hear, before he began to speak. He told me that humanity had not always been united the way the fleet I now lived among appeared to be. For most of their history, his people had fought among themselves more often than they had fought anyone else. Wars fought over land, over belief, over resources that seemed endless until they suddenly were not. He said that humanity had come very close to destroying itself long before ever reaching the stars, and that the scars of that near destruction still shaped how they behaved even now. When humanity finally looked outward, beyond their own world, they carried both the wounds of that history and the lessons learned from surviving it. Daniel explained that the first alien species humanity encountered had greeted them with hostility rather than curiosity, testing their resolve early and harshly. Humanity had not started that conflict, he said, but they had finished it, and finished it in a way that left little room for anyone watching to question their capability. He spoke of the wars that followed with a heaviness in his voice that told me these were not stories he shared easily. 3 separate conflicts, each begun by others who saw humanity as weak, as an easy target for conquest. Each time, humanity had responded not with restraint, but with an intensity that had ended those conflicts swiftly and decisively. It was these wars, Daniel explained, that had built the reputation my own people had grown up fearing, a reputation earned through genuine and terrible force. I asked him why, if this ferocity was true, I had never once seen it directed toward me. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. He said that the wars humanity fought were always wars of necessity, fought only when someone else had chosen violence first, and that once a threat had been neutralized, humanity's instinct was never to continue punishing those who no longer posed danger. He said that mercy toward the defeated, toward the wounded, toward the surrendered, was not a weakness his people struggled with, but a strength they took great pride in, precisely because they understood better than most how easily violence could spiral beyond control if left unchecked by compassion. He told me about how humanity had rebuilt worlds after conflicts ended, offering aid to the very people who had once opposed them, provided those people showed genuine willingness toward peace. He spoke of former enemies who now lived and worked alongside humans, integrated into their society, treated not as prisoners but as neighbors. It was, he admitted, not something every human agreed with. There were those, like Voss, who believed such generosity was foolish, who believed old enemies could never truly become trusted friends. But it was, Daniel insisted, the philosophy that had guided humanity through its darkest years, and the one that ultimately defined who they chose to become, rather than who circumstance had once forced them to be. Ellen joined the conversation as it continued into the night, adding her own perspective from a family that had lived through one of the earlier conflicts firsthand. She told me of her grandmother, who had lost much during those early wars, yet who had spent the rest of her life working to help refugees from the very species that had once threatened humanity's survival. Ellen said her grandmother often told her that surviving something terrible gave a person only 2 choices: to let that pain harden into cruelty passed on to others, or to let it soften into a determination that no one else should have to suffer the same way. Her grandmother, she said, had chosen the second path, and had raised her family to choose it as well. I sat quietly for a long while after they finished speaking, turning their words over in my mind, alongside everything I had witnessed since the crash. It was strange to realize that the ferocity my people feared and the gentleness I had personally experienced were not contradictions after all, but two sides of the very same conviction. Humanity fought fiercely because they valued life deeply, and for that same reason they protected it fiercely once the fighting had ended. I thought of my own people then, of the Koran, and how our own stories about ourselves rarely included such complexity. We were taught simply that we were strong, that our strength justified our expansion, and that other species existed either to be conquered or avoided. I had never once considered, until this moment, that perhaps every species carried stories about itself that left out uncomfortable truths, and stories about others that left out equally important context. Over the following days, I asked more questions, eager now to understand rather than simply survive. Owen told me about the technology humanity had developed not for war, but for healing, machines capable of repairing injuries that would have once been fatal, medicines shared freely with species who had nothing to offer in return. Grace told me about the art her people created, music and stories that explored grief and joy with equal honesty, unafraid to sit with difficult emotions rather than hide from them. I began to understand that the propaganda I had grown up with had not been entirely false, but it had been carefully incomplete. My people had taken humanity's capacity for ferocity and presented it as the whole truth, ignoring the equally powerful capacity for mercy that existed alongside it. It was, I realized, a very effective way to keep an entire species afraid, and fear, I had learned, was far easier to maintain than understanding. One afternoon, Voss summoned me to his office directly, something he had never done before without Daniel or Ellen present as well. I entered cautiously, uncertain what to expect, and found him studying reports scattered across his desk with a tired expression I had not seen on him before. He gestured for me to sit, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he told me that he still did not fully trust me, and likely never would, given everything his own service had taught him about the risks of underestimating an enemy. But he admitted, with clear reluctance, that I had given him no reason during my time on the base to treat me as anything other than what I appeared to be. He said that trust was not something he offered easily, but that he was willing to extend the same patience the others had shown me, provided I continued to prove myself worthy of it. It was not warmth, not the way Ellen or Daniel offered it, but it was something, and I understood it as its own kind of honesty. Voss's suspicion had never been cruelty for its own sake. It had been caution born from experience, the same caution that had likely kept his people alive through the wars Daniel had described. I found, to my surprise, that I respected him more for his honesty than I might have if he had simply pretended to trust me without truly meaning it. That night, I stood alone outside the base, looking up at the unfamiliar stars, and thought about everything I had learned since the crash. I thought about the Koran fleet, somewhere beyond those stars, still believing the same stories I had once believed, still preparing for a war against a species they did not truly understand. I thought about my own captain, who had broken protocol out of curiosity, and wondered if some part of him had suspected, even before his death, that the truth about humanity might be more complicated than we had been told. I did not know yet what I would do with this new understanding. I did not know if I would ever have the chance to share it with my own people, or if I would spend the rest of my life among humans who had shown me more genuine kindness than I had ever expected to receive from anyone, let alone from the species I had once feared most. All I knew, standing beneath that unfamiliar sky, was that the girl who had crashed into this forest, expecting only death, had somehow found something far more complicated and far more valuable waiting for her instead. The alarm came just before dawn, tearing through the quiet of the base with a sound that sent every human running toward their stations. I woke instantly, old instincts flooding back with a speed that surprised me, and I was on my feet before I even understood what was happening. Through the small window of my room, I saw the sky, lit with streaks of falling light, and my stomach dropped as I recognized the shape of the ships descending through the atmosphere. Corran ships. My people had come. I ran through the corridors, dodging soldiers rushing in the opposite direction, until I found Daniel near the command center, already pulling on his gear with practiced speed. He looked up when he saw me, and for a moment, something like fear crossed his face. Not fear of me, but fear of what my presence might mean now that my own people had arrived. I understood immediately what he was thinking. If the Corran had come searching for their missing scout, my continued presence among the humans could be seen as proof of exactly the kind of threat Voss had always warned about. Ellen arrived moments later, breathless, telling us that the ships had already begun deploying troops near the northern perimeter of the base. She said their scanners suggested this was not simply a rescue mission for a missing scout, but something larger, a force strong enough to threaten the entire outpost. I felt my chest tighten with a fear unlike anything I had experienced since the crash itself, because I understood now that everything I had built here, every fragile trust formed over these past weeks, stood at the edge of being destroyed by the very people I had once called my own. Voss found us moments later, his expression hard and focused, already issuing orders to the soldiers around him. When his eyes landed on me, I braced myself for suspicion, for accusation, for the assumption that I had somehow orchestrated this attack. Instead, he simply asked me a direct question. Did I know why my people had come in such numbers? And did I know anything about their capabilities that could help the base survive what was coming? I hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. I told him everything I knew about Corran ship configurations, about their preferred attack patterns, about the weaknesses in their shielding that our own engineers had never fully solved. Daniel and Ellen exchanged a glance, and I understood in that instant that they had not been certain, until this moment, whether I would choose to help or whether the arrival of my own people might pull my loyalty back toward them entirely. I made my choice standing in that command center, surrounded by humans who had shown me more genuine kindness than my own species ever had, and I did not hesitate over it the way I might have expected to weeks earlier. These people had found me wounded and afraid, and had chosen mercy when cruelty would have been easier. I would not repay that mercy with betrayal now, not when they needed my help most. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed before, not because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about both sides. Corran soldiers advanced with the same ruthless efficiency I had been trained to use myself, believing without question that this outpost, and everyone within it, represented nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared. I watched from the command center as human soldiers met that advance with a ferocity that finally showed me, firsthand, the truth behind the reputation Daniel had described to me weeks before. They fought with an intensity that left no room for hesitation, exactly as Daniel had promised they would when truly threatened. Yet even in the chaos of battle, I saw moments that confirmed everything else I had learned about them as well. A human soldier paused under fire to pull a wounded comrade to safety, risking his own life for someone who could offer him nothing in return except survival. Another soldier, cornering a wounded Corran fighter who had fallen and could no longer defend himself, chose to disarm and restrain him rather than end his life outright, even in the middle of active combat. I used everything I knew to help the humans defend their base, directing Daniel's team toward weaknesses in the Corran formation, warning Ellen's medical teams about injuries specific to Corran physiology so they could better treat any wounded who might be captured rather than killed. Voss, to my genuine surprise, listened to every piece of information I offered without question, trusting me, in this moment of crisis, in a way he had never fully trusted me before. The battle turned when a Corran commander, one I recognized from my own fleet's hierarchy, broke through the northern defenses and demanded, over an open channel, that the humans surrender the scout they had captured, or face complete destruction of their base. I heard my own name spoken in that demand, twisted into something that made me sound like a prisoner rather than someone who had chosen, freely, to remain and to help. Voss turned to me then and asked a question I will never forget. He asked if I wanted to go, if returning to my own people was truly what I wished, promising that if it was, he would not stop me from walking toward the ships waiting beyond the perimeter. He said humanity did not believe in holding on to anyone against their will, not even now, not even with the entire base at risk, because of the choice I might make. I looked at him, and at Daniel, and at Ellen standing nearby, with worry etched clearly across her face, and I understood that this moment defined everything I had learned since the crash. I could return to the Corran, to the certainty of my old life, to a species that had never once shown me the kind of mercy these humans had extended so freely. Or I could stay and fight alongside people who had given me every reason to trust them, even knowing that choice might mean facing my own people as an enemy. I chose to stay. I walked to the communication panel myself and spoke directly to the Corran commander, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. I told him the truth, plainly, and without hesitation. I told him that the humans had found me wounded and dying, and had chosen to save my life rather than end it, even though every story we had ever been told promised they would do the opposite. I told him that everything we believed about humanity was built on only half the truth, and that the other half was standing all around me now, fighting fiercely, not out of cruelty, but out of loyalty to people they had sworn to protect. The commander did not want to hear it. He accused me of being corrupted, of having my mind twisted by human deception, and ordered his forces to press the attack even harder. Yet something in my words must have reached at least some of the soldiers listening, because in the chaos that followed, I noticed hesitation in parts of the Corran formation, small pauses that had not existed before, moments where soldiers seemed less certain of the mission they had been sent to complete. The battle raged for hours, but slowly, the tide began to shift. Reinforcements arrived from a nearby human outpost, drawn by Voss's earlier distress signal, and the Corran commander, recognizing the changing odds, finally ordered a retreat rather than risk losing his entire remaining force. As the last of the ships withdrew back toward the sky, I stood in the wreckage of the northern perimeter, surrounded by exhausted human soldiers, and felt something settle inside me that I had not expected to feel. Relief, yes, but also grief, for the Corran soldiers who had died believing a story about humanity that was never entirely true, and grief too, for the version of myself who might have died just as easily, still believing that same story, if fate had not brought me down in that particular forest, in front of that particular woman, with open hands and no weapon raised. In the days that followed the attack, the base slowly returned to something like normal, though nothing about my place within it felt normal anymore. I was no longer simply a rescued prisoner, tolerated out of principle. I had fought beside these humans, had bled information and strategy in their defense, had chosen them over my own people when the moment demanded a choice. Voss came to me personally once the repairs were underway and told me, with more warmth than I had ever heard from him before, that he finally understood why Daniel and Ellen had fought so hard to protect me from the very beginning. Daniel and Ellen threw a small gathering that evening, nothing grand, simply a shared meal among those who had survived the attack together. I sat among them, listening to stories told in a language I now understood fluently, laughing at jokes that no longer needed translation, and I thought back to the girl who had crawled from a burning wreck, expecting nothing but death waiting for her in the forest beyond. I thought of my captain and the curiosity that had cost him his life, and I wondered if he would have been proud to know that his choice, however costly, had eventually led to this moment, to a truth larger than either of our species had ever fully understood on their own. Ellen found me sitting alone later that night, watching the stars from the same courtyard where I had first felt open air against my skin. She sat beside me without a word, and for a long while, we simply watched the sky together in comfortable silence. Finally, she asked me what I planned to do now, whether I intended to remain with them permanently, or whether some part of me still longed to find a way back to my own people someday. I told her the truth. I told her that I did not know what my future held, whether I would ever fully belong among humans, or whether the Koran would ever be willing to hear the truth I now carried, even if I found a way to bring it to them. But I told her, too, that I no longer feared the uncertainty the way I once had, because I had learned something in this place that no amount of fear could ever take from me again. I had come to this world expecting death from the humans I had been taught to fear my entire life. Instead, I had found something far more surprising waiting for me in that forest, something that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with the quiet, stubborn kindness of people willing to extend mercy even to those who had every reason to expect otherwise. Whatever came next, whatever challenges still waited beyond that peaceful sky, I knew I would face them, not as a frightened scout clinging to old fears, but as someone who had learned, in the most unexpected way possible, what it truly meant to be given a second chance.